All right. Well, I'm so happy to host this program on state of the coast, the future of the state of our coast, and the risks we face here, and what some of the solutions are that are being implemented by a wonderful organization, as you all probably know, the Trustees. We're familiar with their work. So Cynthia, welcome. Cynthia Dittbrenner. She recently joined the Trustees as the Director of Coastal and Natural Resources. She has a master's in forest ecology and soils from the University of Washington, and 20 plus years of experience in natural resources, including river and estuary restoration, climate change impacts to the natural systems, and agricultural resilience, and now coastal ecology. So really excited. I think I'm really excited. I hope you all are too, to listen to Cynthia. So Cynthia, it's all yours now. It's all yours now.
Hi, thank you for the
I can't hear.
Cynthia, I think you've been muted by us. You need to unmute.
can you hear me now?
Okay, I'm gonna mute everybody now.
I unmuted myself and then you muted everyone.
I'm gonna mute everyone now. Hopefully.
All right, you can hear me now. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So let's hope this works. That's not what you want. All right. All right, are you seeing it full screen now? No notes? I'm gonna take that as a
yes. Yes.
Okay, I think I have this where I tried to figure it out so I could see my notes on my other screen, but you wouldn't have to see them. So this is new for me. All right, so thanks for having me. I started in August at the Trustees as the Director of Coast and Natural Resources. Very excited to be there. Most of my career was on the West Coast, but was in natural resources, coastal processes, river, marsh. So it's all similar to me, but just with different acronyms and different people. So getting the hang of it over here, but excited to present to you on some of the work we're doing up on the North Shore. And it's going to be kind of a combination presentation talking about some of the climate projections that we pulled in for our State of the Coast report, and then also some restoration work that we're doing. So I don't know how you guys want to handle questions. Do you want to just unmute and shout out, or you want to wait till the end, or do it over chat?
We're going to do, well, we usually reserve questions to the end. Okay. But folks that are attending, just so you know, you can post the questions in chat as well, but we'll hold them till the end, just so we don't interrupt your talk.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so about 5 years ago, the Trustees did a coastal vulnerability assessment. We have 120 miles of coast that we manage, and we were noticing a lot of erosion, changes in the habitat, loss of beaches, and so we hired a consultant to do this coastal vulnerability assessment. And it looked at the impacts of sea level rise and storm surge to date, and then also projected into the future. And it was really illuminating and interesting. It provided a lot of information about what we could do to protect our infrastructure and how we expected to see habitats like saltmarsh changing. So in some respects, it was alarming, made us want to get moving on it. And then it also made us realize, hey, we can't just do this in a silo on our properties. It's something that the whole community needs to be doing together. So we pulled together internal team to create a coastal strategy. So our coastal strategy has these 3 tenets. We've done a lot of work on protecting the coast and advocating. Inspire a love of coast has a lot to do with getting the public out to our sites, engaging students and adults. And then focused on our most vulnerable places was more the scientific side of things, taking a look at the projections, what we expect to see, what types of projects we may want to do. And then part of this effort was we wanted to do a State of the Coast report. So this is where we started talking about how do we make the community bigger? How do we expand outside of our properties? And if you've been familiar with the Trustees, that is not something we normally do. as most land trusts, we focus on our properties. So this was a new thing. And we said, we want to be able to provide all of these projections to the communities living along the coast. We want to help them with resilience. And then also our partners doing natural area restoration. We wanted to be part of that discussion as well. So our goal is to launch 5 State of the Coast reports over 5 years, 1 for each section of the coast. So the first one we did was in 2020, and that was the North Shore. And that's what I'll be talking about today. And then the second one was launched last summer, and that was the islands. So Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and the Elizabeth Islands. Before I launch into the data, I want to just give everyone baseline understanding of what the projections are for sea level rise and storms. So this graph on the left shows sea level rise. That green line is historic sea levels for the Boston area. They've been rising steadily. And then on the right, you see 4 different colored dotted lines. Those represent 4 different future scenarios. And they're based on different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So that means it's dependent on how much carbon we emit. So the track that we're on right now is that orange line, the high line. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's here. Clearly, lots of politics and efforts around the world to try and get us onto one of the blue lines, but still an upward momentum. So the projections that I report today are based on that high scenario because that's what the state recommends we plan towards. So what that is by 2030, sea level rise of 1.3 feet. Now that started in 2000, so we're already well on our way there. By 2050, sea level rise of 2.5 feet, and by 2070, 4.3 feet. Now, along with that, if you're familiar with climate change impacts, we're expecting and have been seeing more increased storm events. So this graph on the right, if the people's faces are in the way, you can kind of grab that bar on the top and move it over. I keep meaning to move this graph because I'm always presenting in Zoom and people can't see it. But this gives a flood surge level. So this is floods. These are storms. So the light orange is a 1 in 10 year storm event. That's a storm that you would expect to see about every 10 years. In each individual year, there's a 10% chance that you'll see it. So these are storms, not high tides. And then the dark orange is a 1 in 100 year event. So that's a storm you'd expect to see once in a lifetime. So the first set of bars are historic. What's an interesting comparison is that by 2050, this 1 in 10 year storm, the light orange, is about the same as the 1 in 100 year storm right now. So that means a big storm that we'd only see once in a lifetime, we'll see more frequently, about every 10 years into the future. And then those charts continue going up, like the 2100 numbers are astronomically higher. So I don't even know what that would look like on the landscape. So with that, I will talk about key findings. Those are the 2 factors we looked at. What are the impacts of sea level rise and storm surge on our coast? Here is a picture of the shorelines in your neck of the woods. And you'll see that a lot of the coast is developed. So 12.8 miles is developed. Coastal Banks is 11 miles, Coastal Beach 2 miles. This part of the coastline is very rocky, as you know, because you live there. But there are some beaches scattered amongst rocky headlands. These are the numbers actually for Rockport over here on the left. I'll talk a little bit more about this. So beaches, where there are beaches, we've been seeing increasing erosion. This is a picture at Long Beach where they did a project. Now, so my understanding is that seawall was built in 1938 and hasn't really seen a lot of repairs since then, or at least not large repairs. And so it's deteriorating. And sometime in the last few years, the town came in and reinforced it with rock all along and then covered it in sand. So that's a sand nourishment project there. Now, conversely, here's a picture of Crane Beach nearby that the Trustees owns and manages. The red represents areas that have been eroding, and the green is areas that have been building up or accreting. we're seeing so much more erosion than accretion out there. We've lost, let's see, 112 acres since the 1950s, which is the equivalent of 84 football fields. And just in the last 20 years, we've lost 2,000 feet in length. So erosion happening at two very different beaches. In Rockport, you've got infrastructure there. And so the town needs to come in and protect the seawall and protect the infrastructure there. It can cost millions of dollars. At a more natural setting, we've decided to let nature take its course, although we will take advantage of opportunities where we can. For example, if they're dredging the river and can put some sand on the beach, then we're exploring that. Now, a lot of the shorelines in this area are armored. So the picture on the right, all of those red lines show armored shorelines. So those are revetments, riprap, seawalls. The problem in some of these cases is that well, in all of them, I think it's safe to say they weren't designed for climate change impacts. So they were seeing increasing storms and forces of waves, which is taking their toll on these infrastructure. And so in addition to increased waves, we're also seeing sea level rise. So just more water volume in general. So they're overtopping risks. The environmental impacts, they don't create habitat for very many creatures. They also tend to transfer some of those erosive impacts to the next spot down. So the erosion doesn't go away, it just gets shifted and can sometimes be worse where there isn't a wall. And they can be very costly to repair. So one thing we've been talking about with communities about is alternatives to armored shoreline. This is an example of a project in Salem at Collins Cove, where it was mostly a rock wall around this cove, and they decided to redesign it using nature for protection. So what they did was they created a fringe marsh the whole way around. Here's a picture. This bottom picture is actually just the design. It's probably not quite that beautiful, but I didn't have a current photo of it. But they went in and placed some coir logs to secure. They put some sand in and some soil and planted with beach grass, or salt marsh grass to create a salt marsh. And studies have shown that even a small fringe salt marsh like this can really attenuate the waves and protect the communities behind it. We also looked at flooding along the developed coast. This picture on the right is an example of what our flood maps look like. Let me move you guys here. So you can access these online, and I'll give you that link so you can kind of explore where you live in your community and see what the impacts are. But this is the type of map you'll see. We pulled in flooding projections from coastal zone management from the state. So this is not our modeling work, but then we had a consultant overlay that with buildings and roads and determine which structures were going to be impacted or at risk. So that the red shows daily tidal flooding in 2050. So in 30 years, daily tidal flooding. And then these light green squares, these are structures that are going to be at risk in 2050. And then the yellow is the 100-year flood event. So the 1% flooded chance that it would flood this big every year. And then the white show the structures at risk there. This is in Salisbury. So I pulled in, oops. Oh, let me show you this, and then I'll show you some pictures from Long Beach. So this is a graph that we included in the report showing buildings that will be inundated by 10-year storms. So a 10-year storm is one that people tend to connect with a little more, because a 100-year storm, we think, oh, we'll only see one of those in our lifetime. It's not really a big deal. But the 10-year storm happens frequently. So by 2030, 5,000 buildings in this whole region will be inundated in a 10-year storm. So these are just all of the different towns with the numbers adding up. So here is where you can access the online maps. Here's the website up here in the purple on the coast.thetrustees.org. And you'll see a website like this when you go there. And then if you click maps over here on the left, you can select these different types of maps you want to view. So what you've been looking at is projected flooding. And actually, I think this is a picture of the coastal ones. I'm sorry, the islands. You can't actually access these erosion maps for your area. We don't have them, but the flooding is what we're looking at now. So here I pulled some screenshots from my mapping system on my computer just to show you how these projections look at a place closer to home for you in Long Beach here. So this is in Rockport. So the blue shows current. We always say historic tidal or daily flooding. We say historic because it's based on historic actual data. But this is essentially what the daily tidal flooding should look like currently. Now, keep in mind, I did present this to the Long Beach Options Committee and people were saying, oh, this road floods before this one. Is this really accurate? This is done, the modeling is done on a 75-foot grid. So there's a point every 75 feet. So it's not incredibly accurate to zoom in this close. It gives you a general idea of where it's going to flood. But if you say, hey, my neighbor's house is going to flood and not mine, then that's too specific of a conclusion to make. And we're also not sure if it fully took in the seawall here. So keep that in mind as I show you these pictures going forward, because the seawall does afford some protection. But again, a lot of the flooding here comes from the backside as the water fills into this salt marsh area. Okay, so this is daily tidal flooding. This is daily tidal flooding in 2030. So that's with 1.3 feet of sea level rise. Here's daily tidal flooding in 2050 with 2.5 feet of sea level rise. So you start to see the water is on the ground anyway for a lot of these houses down here near the end, especially now if those houses are raised, it's not taking that into account. This just means there's water on the ground in those areas. And then here's 2070. So with 4.3 feet of sea level rise, you see quite a big impact because this is a barrier beach. It's very low lying. So you can see a lot of these houses are now going to experience daily flooding if these projections are accurate. Now here's the 10-year flood. So this is not daily tidal flooding anymore. This is the 10-year storm flood. So what you would expect to see every 10 years. Evidently, this is what it's supposed to look like now. And I was told that this might be a little bit wet. And that's probably because it's not taking into account the seawall. So keep that in mind as you look forward. I mean, these are just a planning tool. Here's what it's supposed to look like in 2030. So that's a 10-year flood. Here's 2050, and here's 2070. So by 2070, if these projections are right, this entire area will go under, all of these houses will go under in a 10-year flood if they're not raised. So what we did on top of that was we pulled the infrastructure in and we said, okay, what infrastructure is at risk so we could quantify it. So this light green, this is for 2050. This light green is buildings and roads that will be flooded daily. The pink is buildings and floods that would be flooded, buildings and structures, buildings and roads, sorry, that would be flooded in a 10-year storm event. And then the yellow is a 100-year storm event. So I'm assuming you're going to ask me questions about this. I'll be prepared to come back to it afterwards. All right, so here's an example of a type of adaptive design project you can do. This is the road out to Crane Beach. So if you can see down here at the bottom, this is that main road that goes out to the parking lot in Crane Beach. And right here, where this little tidal inlet crosses, is a low spot. And that's where we're going to be conducting our project. We have a couple big culverts there. That road has been going underwater in storms. We have to close it more and more frequently. And then by 2070, I think it's projected to go underwater every day at a high tide. So we've gotten funding so far to complete the design and permitting for raising that road 2 feet. But the construction itself is going to cost over $5 million. So this just gives you an idea of, wow, if we were to do this at a large scale for all of these coastal communities, it's going to take quite a bit of investment. So I'm going to shift to salt marshes. On the North Shore, we have the Great Marsh System, which is 20,000 acres of salt marsh, the largest salt marsh in New England. It's absolutely beautiful and provides critical function for protection against storms and habitat. And the question really is, can the salt marsh keep pace with sea level rise? So as the seas rise, are they going to inundate the salt marsh and it's going to become open water? Marshes naturally accrete sediment, meaning that they trap sediment and they build up over time. They're always growing in height. So this graph shows in blue, this is projected sea level rise, and the dark green is projected marsh accretion naturally based on current rates. And at some point in the future, those two lines are going to cross and we're going to have open water. So our goal is to get the salt marsh to accrete more rapidly, which would be this light yellow line, so it can keep up with sea level rise, and it wouldn't hurt for sea level rise to not rise quite that much as well. So working at it from two fronts. So I'm going to show you, first I'll tell you why our salt marsh is important. I touched on that they protect you from floods. They provide critical habitat for wildlife, also wildlife that we rely on for our economy, such as shellfish. They filter pollutants such as nutrients and other contaminants and keep our waters clean. And they store an incredible amount of carbon. So speaking of trying not to emit as much carbon or sequestering more so that we're on one of those lower tracks of our sea level rise projections, salt marshes store 10 times or more than forests do. So here's where I zoomed into an area around Crane Beach. This is Crane Beach on the bottom right here. This is an area of marsh that we're working in. We did some modeling. It's called SLAM modeling, sea levels affecting marsh migration. And actually we did not. It was the state CZM, Coastal Zone Management, that did this modeling, and we pulled it into our report. This light green that's covering most of the marsh here represents high salt marsh. And then this light, like blue turquoise color that you see kind of interspersed among the open water here, that's low salt marsh. So high salt marsh is going to flood once or twice a month at the spring tides. Low salt marsh floods daily. So it's a different kind of grass, salt marsh grass composition, and it provides different types of habitat. The high salt marsh is very, very important to protect our communities against floods. If you can imagine, if the marsh is flooded, it's not going to protect us as much from those waves and storms coming in. So here's what it looks like right now. And then here's what it looks like in 2070. So you can see, I'll toggle back and forth a little, that all of that light green, most of that light green high salt marsh is now turned into that low salt marsh, meaning it's flooded daily. So that's going to mean certain species like the salt marsh sparrow that lays its creates a nest, lays its eggs, and fledges its young in between those high tides that happen once a month. Those are probably going to go to extinct because they won't have habitat anymore. So here's what a lot of our marsh looks like. You can't necessarily tell this from the road, although you probably can see the ditches as you drive by. But looking at it from overhead is just really interesting because most of the marsh looks like this. It's based on an agricultural legacy where these areas were ditched to dry them out a little bit so we could get tractors out there and harvest salt marsh hay. And then later, the ditches were maintained because it was thought that by drying out the marsh, we were controlling mosquitoes. So in areas like this, what you have is a marsh that's drier than it should be. And because that marsh is not as wet, the organic matter that makes up the soil decomposes more quickly. And so it actually sinks, it subsides and sinks as it decomposes. It also is not allowing the water to spread out over the marsh when the tides come in. And when that water spreads out over the marsh, it slows it down and traps sediment, and the sediment builds the marsh up. That's what we want to have happening, is the water spreading out and dropping sediment. What we also have been seeing is that in certain places where either it has subsided so much because it's decomposed, or where there's a ditch that got clogged, we're having these big pools form, which wouldn't normally have been there. And so these pools are waterlogging the grass and killing the grass. So we've got certain areas that are wetter than they should be and certain areas that are drier than they should be. And really we need to get that water just spreading out across the marsh so that it can build up sediment and keep up with sea level rise. So we've launched a project. We've got 3 phases of funding right now, totaling about 1,300 acres. We've secured $2 million. And then these blocks of color over here on the map show where all of that work is happening. We do have a lot of partners who are also doing a lot of work out there. I think in total, there's about 4,000 acres of work that is moving forward. So this is what that looks like. The red are berms. So they're actually raised areas where the ditch spoils were piled. The green and blue are ditches. The green ones are ones that we're going to fill or remediate. And the blue ones are ones that we're going to make sure are still open because the salt marsh needs some open channels to drain. It's just we have too many right now. So very, very complicated system to go out there and figure out what the plan is and which ones you're going to fill and not. So this is the technique. It's really elegantly simple. We cut salt marsh hay along the side of the ditch, push it into the ditch, secure it with some twine, and then allow that to accumulate sediment over the year. The water flushes in, drops sediment in that area and builds up. We do that 3 years in a row. Sometimes it only takes 2. And then the ditch essentially heals itself and starts growing salt marsh plants again. The other piece of that is creating runnels, and runnels are just little ditches to help drain some of those big ponded areas where there isn't a ditch we can just clean out. So right now we are doing this out in Essex and Newbury, and if you were driving to Crane Beach the last couple of weeks, you may have seen it happening there on the right side of the road. But here's our contractor out here using these boards. He moves very slowly because you have to move these boards everywhere so he doesn't mess up the marsh with his tracks, and then digs these very shallow, about 6-inch ditches to drain these areas that are too waterlogged. And then he also piles the spoils in these little, what we call nesting islands, which will overgrow with vegetation and then provide habitat. And we're going to monitor to see if those provide habitat for some of these salt marsh sparrows so that they don't see too much inundation. So there's lots of different coastal resilience strategies. What do we do about this? And I've touched on a lot of them throughout the presentation. So I just want to review quickly. There's protection and adaptation, and often this is thought of as part of the built environment. So protection would be building a seawall. Adaptation would be raising a road or raising existing structures or building in a way that's more adaptive to these future projections. Now, protection can also be more natural, like the living shoreline example I showed you in Collins Cove. We tend to think of that in the next spin, which is restoration and conservation. Restoring and protecting salt marshes is going to be a huge buffer for us against the impacts of storms, and then just conserving as much land as we can. And then, of course, the other option is retreat and relocation. So I didn't talk a lot about this. This is a picture from the Boston Globe, Plum Island in 2013. We hear more and more about these events happening around the state or around the region. Costs a lot of money to protect communities from the impacts of storm surge and sea level rise. So a lot of towns and the state are working together to do planning to figure out how do we adapt, where do we prioritize, what do we do, how do we get funding for it. I think it would be beneficial for the state if there was more regional efforts to do that instead of each town having to do their own. And so that's one reason the trustees are trying to help out and make sure everyone has the information and knows and can work with us and others to find a path forward. So a few additional things. This is an ugly slide, so you can just listen to me. But there's a lot of funding that's coming about that could help communities with this. The American Rescue Plan Act, Massachusetts received $5.2 billion for that, and we have about $4.6 billion remaining. And so the trustees worked with the state to influence how that gets allocated. And there's a significant amount that's going towards restoration and coastal resilience. And then the Build Back Better, that was a bill that got stalled out at the federal level, but there are now talks about pulling different pieces apart. There's a huge climate resilience section. Can we pull that out and get something passed to provide funding for communities? People often ask what they can do. You can open those maps, find out how climate change is going to impact your own property, your own community. You can reach out to your town or state officials, send your concerns to them. People respond greatly when their constituents reach out to them in most cases. Watch for local meetings. Sometimes your town will have different planning efforts like the Long Beach Options Committee that you can get involved in. And another would be volunteer or donate to a local organization and engaged in things that you care about. I think I would be remiss to not also say that there's the other side of this, where if we could slow climate change, we won't be seeing some of these high projections. And so anything you can do in that realm as well would help out. So here is my contact information, and I guess I'll open it up for questions. Maybe I talked too fast. Is that too quick, Shubra? I'm happy to open up the online map too, if you have time and you want me to just tool around on different spots to check out what the projections are.
If you would like to see everybody in the meeting, you can change your view.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll stop share.
There you go.
Right. I don't see any questions posted to chat, so we should just open it up. Folks who have questions, please jump in. Unmute yourself first and then jump in.
Cynthia, is it possible for you to bring up the map that shows Rockport?
Yeah, the online map.
Yeah, yeah. In
Yeah.
case you have questions while you're here.
Yep.
That's the name of her. That's her name. No, that must be the person running the meeting. Oh, that
I'll share my screen and show you how it works. Oh, there. Hang on a second. There, can you see that map?
Yes.
All right. So some people get into this map and think, oh gosh, I can't make it do anything. You have to click these two little arrows up here. It's not terribly user-friendly. And then you'll see all of the different layers you can turn on and off. So here's Rockport. So if we zoom in, we want to see Front Beach.
Sure.
Okay, so here's current flooded daily is the blue, and then the orange is the 10-year flood event, and the yellow is the 100-year flood event. I want to zoom in enough for you to see, but I also, okay, so then what you can do is you can turn on different levels. So let's turn on 2050. Here's 2050 projected flooding. Of course, it's a different color. I'm working on making this more user-friendly. But the red is the flooded daily, the orange is the 10-year, and the yellow is the 100-year storm event. So you can start to see like this area around here is being impacted. And then in 2070, I wish you could like keep the previous one on before clicking another. So one way to look at it too that is easier is up here we have buildings flooded at the ground level, and so you can just turn on 2050 buildings flooded at the ground level, and then the green is ones that are flooded at a high tide daily. The pink are flooded in a 10-year storm event, and yellow are a 100-year storm event. So you can start to see if in the next 30 years you're gonna have water at the base of your structure, either daily or in a 10-year storm event. The pink is the 10-year storm event.
I saw a question come up from Carol. Carol, you want to just unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, I would be happy to do that. Going back to one of your last slides, you talked about funds that were now available to the Commonwealth as a result of the Infrastructure Act. And I'm wondering how those funds get distributed, if communities need to apply for them, and if you or anyone else knows if Rockport has applied for any of those funding sources.
I don't think we have been able to apply yet. So there have been some organizations that have requested earmarks from the fund and gotten small chunks of money that way, but the bulk of the money is still there and will go out through a grant process is my understanding. So we haven't heard yet what the application process will be.
So there aren't applications on the street currently.
No.
Okay.
One thing I was thinking of was creating some sort of listserv with all of our communities and interested parties that have worked with us on the coast so that I could send emails out and say, hey, look, this funding source is available now, because I don't have a way to communicate with everyone. We can put it on our website, I suppose, but people don't look. So if you have ideas, you know.
Cynthia, I would say that if you were to put Lisa Sims or myself on that list, you know,
Okay.
we can make sure, you know, as we find out more about who in town is working on it, we can make sure it at least gets to them as of now, you know, since we don't
Okay.
have any official channels. Does that make
Okay.
sense, Lisa?
Yes, it does.
We
Okay.
do, you know, the Garden Club has an environmental impact committee. So I think we are definitely interested and concerned. So, you know, we're not, I don't know what we'll do about the coastline at this point. We don't have any initiatives, but
Mhm.
we may find ways to do something.
Okay.
Hi, I have a question. Okay, if I ask a question?
Sure.
Sure.
Okay. Rockport is rock bound. I mean, there are many parts of this area that have very high granite rock. Kind of, how protective is that going to be as we go forward? What are the projections? Is that going to protect Rockport more than, say, other parts of the North Shore?
I would say, yeah. I was just going to zoom out here a little bit so you could see, like, this right here, Front Beach is a low lying area. So that's where you're seeing a lot of impacts to the infrastructure. But you know, you do see some impacts in a 10-year storm out to 2050 for some of these buildings out here. But a lot of, but not so much as other areas. More than I expected, though. Long Beach. But yes, in general, like, we're doing a report right now on the South Coast. So Buzzards Bay area, and towns like Wareham and Bourne and Merriam are really low lying, and the water comes up through Buzzards Bay kind of in a funnel effect and funnels down and just floods over those communities. And so you see a lot of structures at risk in the next 30 to 50 years. I would say one of the bigger impacts in the Rockport area would be impacts to those protective structures. So your seawalls and your rock walls with the increasing wave impacts.
Right. I would say, just a suggestion to share that information, Lisa, that you're going to get, and the club's going to get, with Tom Mickus, who authored the petition that, or the document that went out to all of us, to some of us in the League of Women's Voters, and then to the Rockport Garden Club on climate change, that is presenting to the board, because he's very active in trying to do something, have a positive effect.
Beverly, you have a question. There's a question from Beverly. You want to just pose it? You want me to read it out?
I have a beach house on a barrier island in New Jersey, and it was destroyed during Sandy. And I know the impact of the water on that whole barrier island is, you know, horrible. Is there something similar with a coastal strategy in New Jersey as well?
You know, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with it. I could find out. Being so new to this position in the East Coast is probably the reason I don't know.
Because they have rebuilt along that whole barrier island. When you fly over it in an airplane, and they have rebuilt all these huge homes along that barrier island again. And I'm sure, you know, they're going to be overpowered by water soon.
Yeah, there are some interesting things I didn't touch on that you can do offshore. So in addition to just protecting your actual coastline. Well, for example, there are some areas that have done oyster beds offshore, and that those attenuate the waves and kind of slow the wave action down, dissipate the wave action, or artificial reefs offshore.
Well, they have built a whole dune system. I think it was like 32 feet high, 18 feet and
I
underground.
can't hear you very well. I think the
Okay, the
you
dune
go.
system.
There you
Uh-huh.
go.
Okay, the whole barrier island built a whole dune system, 32 feet high. 18 feet went underground and is now a huge sand dune, and 18 is underground. But I don't think it's going to hold back the sea to the communities beyond.
Yeah. Yeah, sand nourishment projects, whether it's dune nourishment project on the dune itself or a beach nourishment project out in front on the beach, they don't last a long time. Like especially the beach nourishment projects, that sand moves away. You have to do long stretches of it to get it to stay for a number of years. And we did a dune nourishment project out on Martha's Vineyard at Norton Point Beach just this last fall. We put 11,000 cubic yards of sand out there to build up this dune that had been overwashing. And then we have to do phase 2 this next year. But that first phase cost about $500,000, which was cheap. And the reason being is because they were dredging the sand from Katama Bay right behind the project. But if you have to haul sand in from somewhere else, it can be millions of dollars. So we were looking at projects out on Nantucket because our Coskata-Coatue Wildlife Refuge is out there and lots of dunes and potential for overwash there, breaching with Nantucket Harbor. And the projects that our consultants scoped out there were large dune nourishment projects, just dumping a bunch of sand. And they were in the millions of dollars. And when they ran the models to see how long it would last, most of these projects they ran it for a 2-year storm event. So a storm that is big enough that it happens about every 2 years. And 2/3 of the dune washed away in the first 2-year storm event. So it's a 10-year project life, but it could be washed out in the first year or two if you get big storms. So it's really hard to prioritize spending that kind of money on a natural area. So what I see happening in the future is people prioritize spending for those types of projects where it's protecting human infrastructure in towns and big roads. And then at some of these natural areas, we just need to watch nature take its course and things are going to change.
Yeah, you can't hold back the sea. No.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Uh-huh.
Question.
Karen, you want to read your question?
Sure. I wanted to know if there were examples of small-scale salt marsh restoration along the North Shore. So what would make sense? Is there anything a small community could do in a particular area that would have an impact?
Yeah, I think that example I showed of Collins Cove, that can be done at a very small scale. So that was just a fringe salt marsh where they created, I don't know, from the picture, it looked like it was maybe 30 feet of salt marsh, not very much. So if you wanted to take your rock wall or revetment out and instead do what's called this living shoreline approach, it would probably be a combination of putting in a coir log, maybe some sand, and then planting it and letting it be more of that gradual slope. So that allows waves to wash up. It doesn't erode it as much. The waves get absorbed by some of the vegetation. I think it's a scary concept. Like if my house was on the water and I had a wall and someone said, pull out the wall and plant some grass, I would be thinking, are you sure? So I guess before pulling a structure out, I would hire a consulting firm that knew what they were doing to actually design it. But if you have a natural area and you just want to augment it by putting in some vegetation, that would always help. I can't point to any small examples that I know of other than the Collins Cove, just because I don't know the history of the area very well, but I'm sure that there have been some. I could find out if you were interested.
I got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Cynthia?
Yeah, I'm sorry. My name's Diana, and I'm a new homeowner in Rockport in the Eden Road area. And I was just wondering, does Rockport have a retreat plan yet at all?
So the state provides funding through this MVP program. It's called Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness. And Rockport has gone through the process of creating their municipal vulnerability preparedness plan. So they have an MVP plan. And then what that's supposed to allow them to access once they've created that plan is allow them to access this bigger pot of MVP funding to actually construct projects. So I don't know where they're at with constructing projects, but I can certainly send you guys the link to the plan so you can check it over. Some of these communities do the plan and then it sits on the shelf and nothing happens because it's such a huge investment of funding to implement some of these actions. And so that's why I don't know where Rockport is in that scenario.
Thank you.
Sorry, I should have read that before the meeting.
Other questions, folks?
Hi, it's Celia Rankin. My question is, do you have a sense of what will happen to the beaches in Rockport, Front Beach, Cape Hedge Beach? If it we naturally let nature take its course, will we lose our beaches? Will the beaches move back? How does it work? Naturally.
Yeah, they would move back, right? So, and so it depends if there's a place for them to migrate. Like a lot of barrier beaches, like Long Beach, that may move back as sediment overtops it and it builds on the backside. That's a lot of what we see on the barrier beaches is start building up on the backside where you've got salt marshes and different types of habitat. So naturally the beach would migrate. In an area that's not a barrier beach like Front Beach, yeah, it would migrate inland if there was space to do so. What we're seeing on a lot of our beaches though is that it's just getting steeper because all the wave action is carving the sand out. And so instead of having this long gradual beach, you've got it eating away at the higher elevation land and it's just eroding it and creating more of a steep beach there. So depending on the elevation gain behind Front Beach, it would either migrate or it would just erode into a wall and create a steeper beach. So I'm not familiar enough with that area to be able to tell you exactly.
I have a question.
Ed Hans has, oh, sorry. Ed Hans has a question. He's been raising his hands after you.
Oh. Susan,
Sorry,
first.
Yeah, Susan, you can go first, and then Ed has a question.
Well, I just have a question or a statement. We have a breakwater out there, and over the years, it has certainly disappeared. I mean, partly. And I wonder if there's no chance of ever putting it back together, but I wonder what happens as the years go on and it gets smaller and smaller, what the impact will actually be on beaches like Old Garden or Front Beach, and any of the area along the coast that aims out towards that breakwater.
I can say very generally, yeah, that you would expect to see bigger waves if that went away, but I'm not familiar with the breakwater. Can you say more about that, Susan?
The breakwater was put there years and years and years ago in high hopes of having the Navy have their fleet out here.
Oh,
and
I see.
That never came to pass. And it runs a long, long way out there. A lot of it's underwater. But there's still a part that's above water, and it's right to the left of Salvages. And but I wonder over the years if it'll make a difference, because it certainly is damaged when we have these horrendous storms.
I imagine it would.
It's an interesting thing on the computer, by the way, if you look it up.
I'm trying to find it. Where is it?
It should be Sandy Bay. Might be under Sandy Bay.
Okay. Oh, I see.
If on the map you look out from the inner harbor straight out, I don't know how far, it's called the Ledges. The rocks only show up in low tide.
Oh.
It's an incompleted breakwater that was built like, I don't know, 50 years ago. No, not 50, but back in the 40s or 50s.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's designed to do what it is in the name, right? Break water. So there's, yeah, any kind of protection out in the water like that is gonna protect you against waves. So in a lot of areas of the state, we have these barrier beaches that are protecting us against storms, and those are eroding and overtopping with sea level rise. And then in some places you have things like this breakwater, and others you have more active wall, like down in New Bedford. The Port of New Bedford has a huge hurricane barrier that they've put up that protects against storms. So yeah, as the water rises and that becomes less effective, you would expect to see more erosion happening on the actual shore.
I have one question about the, like after Sandy hit years ago, Beverly knows what happened there on the Jersey Shore and in New York. But it came to light that many of the multi-million-dollar homes that were built right on the beach had been rebuilt somewhat with federal funds again and again. It wasn't the first time. Has there been anything on the federal level that would channel, instead of paying for these huge homes to be rebuilt in a place that's going to get hit again, for that money to be channeled instead to preserving public beaches and land in general? Fund that money instead of helping rebuild where they're rebuilding right where they're going to get impacted again.
Excellent question. Yeah, so the federal money goes through FEMA, and most of those programs, a lot of the programs historically, you haven't even been able to access that money until your home was impacted several times by floods. And then you'd finally be eligible for the funds and you could use it to raise your house, for example. Now they have a new program called the BRIC program, and I couldn't tell you what that stood for, but it's supposed to be more proactive. If you're in a flood zone, you can think ahead. But again, my understanding is to elevate or adapt the design of your structure in its place. We as the trustees have tried to push through legislation this last year for Massachusetts for what's called flood risk reduction program, flood risk protection program, FRPP. And that is what it's designed to do. And I don't think it's going to pass this year. Legislation often takes a few years, but we've got a lot of nonpartisan interest. Is it would provide funding to, in addition to the FEMA funding, for people who are in one of these areas, it's like a flood risk zone, to access the funding, and it would buy them out. They would remove the house and restore it to a natural area. So that's the kind of thing we're advocating. Let's not keep rebuilding. We can spend our money on the really important roads and town infrastructure that needs to be adaptive, but in areas that that maybe it's a losing battle, or that would benefit the community more to turn it into a natural area to protect the homes behind it, we need to be thinking about retreating from those areas. So hopefully that will get some traction next legislative season.
Ed, do you still have your question?
Oh, yeah.
Going back through things, the breakwater, which you're talking about, was built in the 1890s, and it was designed to go from Straitsmith Island almost, just about Straitsmith Island, all the way to Halibut Point almost, leaving openings at either end to allow shipping. A large part of it got built. I did a quick study to see how much rock there is out there, granted, because some of those capstones, which are, according to my barber years ago, were actually being knocked off. I couldn't believe it, but they're 20 tons a piece, some of them. But sure enough, they have been knocked off. And when I floated the idea of maybe using some of that stone to extend Granite Pier as an alternative to some other plans, I was told that it actually does have a wave attenuation effect, even though it's not above the water level. Granted, but it has a major impact. And so that, maybe the best thing to do would be to take some more of that rock off and put it, just spread it out a little bit more to increase the length of that, the length of it. The other thing is that you talk about a hardened area, a beach moving back. Both Long Beach obviously can't move back as long as the wall's there. I mean, yes, there can be some, I guess, earth deposited in the salt marsh behind it, just naturally. But the big beach is not going to. And then the same thing with Back Beach and Front Beach. They've got hardened behind them. One with housing and one with just a road. So I don't see how any of those beaches are going to migrate anywhere.
No, plus the structures are blocking the sand from overtopping and moving.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's how a natural beach would work. Yeah.
No, right.
Right.
I have a book, Sandy Bay,
Yeah.
National Harbor of Refuge and the Navy. And this was written by Paul St. Germain. Do you remember this one, Ed?
Yes, in fact, I talked to Paul before I did these calculations, and he was very helpful in getting some of the information together, right? Exactly.
Any other questions, folks? Well, we're almost out of time. If there are no more questions, I'd just like to thank Cynthia for her very, very insightful presentation and question answers.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Very much.
You're welcome.
Program.
Thank you.
Cynthia, thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for attending our first program this year.
Schubert, Ed has his hand back.
Oh, Ed's got his hand back, sorry. Ed.
I read recently that they're trying to put together a Rockport Resilience Committee. Have you heard anything about that? Anybody?
No.
I have not.
Okay.
There's also the Green Committee that's going for a net zero, but that's the other side of it,
Right.
net zero emissions, right?
Right.
So we're doing things, but we're not far enough along.
Actually, Schubert, that group is not affiliated. I mean, they're affiliated with the Green Task Force, but they are not the Green Task Force. They're just 17 interested parties.
Oh, I see.
Who grouped.
For the net zero.
Right, for the net zero.
Right.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Yeah, feel free to email me with additional questions. I don't have the legacy of knowing a lot of the history around, which you guys know much better than me, but I can definitely look things up if you're curious.
Thank you again.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.